The fog drifted low across St. Mary Mead as though the village itself were exhaling secrets it could no longer bear. Dawn had only just begun to tease the edges of the sky when Miss Marple stepped out onto her garden path, her shawl pulled close around her thin shoulders. The air felt unusually still, the kind of stillness that pressed upon one's senses rather than soothed them. She paused, her sharp eyes narrowing toward the quiet lane that curved past the vicarage and toward Willow Cottage, where the new tenant, Eleanor Harrow, had moved in only a month ago. Willow Cottage had always been one of those houses that drew whispers. Its ivy-coated walls and old stone chimney gave it a charming appearance, but the locals claimed the charm ended sharply at the doorstep. Doors that sometimes shut themselves, faint noises at odd hours, and a lingering smell of lavender that appeared when no lavender grew anywhere nearby. None of these details frightened Miss Marple. She had known far more unsettling things in her time, but they did interest her. Human behavior, after all, often left trails more curious than any ghostly tale. That morning, as she watered the lilies, she heard hurried footsteps approaching along the garden fence. Mrs. Pennington, the baker's wife, came rushing toward her, face flushed and breath uneven. Miss Marple straightened, instantly alert, though her expression remained pleasantly mild. "Oh, Miss Marple, thank heavens you're already awake," Mrs. Pennington gasped. "There's been a dreadful scene at Willow Cottage. Eleanor Harrow is in a terrible fright." Miss Marple set the watering can aside with deliberate calm. "A fright? At this hour? She says she heard someone inside the house last night. Someone walking about the drawing room. She swears she locked all her doors, and this morning she found the back door standing wide open." The faintest crease marked Miss Marple's brow. Eleanor Harrow was a young woman of about 30, refined but evidently fragile beneath her polished composure. "Did she see anyone?" "No, but she wouldn't stay inside another minute. She's gone to the vicarage now." Miss Marple didn't waste time on questions Mrs. Pennington couldn't answer. Her steps, steady but brisk, carried her down the lane. Morning light strengthened slowly, illuminating the familiar cottages, the iron lamp-posts, the well-swept gardens. Yet even under that comforting glow, Miss Marple felt a thread of tension woven into the village's quiet fabric. The vicarage door stood open when she arrived. Eleanor sat in the front room with a cup of untouched tea trembling in her hands. Her hair was loosely pinned, and dampness beneath her eyes suggested a night spent awake rather than asleep. "Miss Marple," she whispered, relief softening her features. "I don't know what to do." The vicar's wife hovered compassionately beside her, but stepped aside as Miss Marple approached. With gentle precision, the old woman seated herself opposite Eleanor and folded her hands. "Tell me everything exactly as it happened, my dear." Eleanor swallowed hard. "I went to bed just after 11. The house was quiet. I checked all the doors myself, I always do. And then, sometime past 1, I woke up. I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as though someone were pacing. "Downstairs?" Miss Marple prompted. "Yes, the drawing room, I believe." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the teacup. "I thought it must be my imagination, but when I listened, they continued. Not loud, just frighteningly certain." "And you did not investigate?" Eleanor gave a small, shuddering laugh. "I'm afraid not. I stayed in bed and waited for them to stop. When silence finally came, I barely slept. And at dawn, when I went down, the back door was open." Miss Marple observed her with a keen, subtle gaze. "Nothing out of place inside? No drawers disturbed? No missing items?" "Nothing," Eleanor said quickly. "Everything was just as I'd left it." The vicar entered then, his expression grave. "Jones, our constable, is on his way. But I must say, it is troubling." Miss Marple nodded, though her mind was already moving past the obvious concerns. An intruder who left nothing stolen was unsettling. An intruder who made noise but caused no seeming harm, more curious still. "I should like to see the cottage," she said calmly. Eleanor hesitated. "I don't think I can go back just yet." "You needn't. Let the constable escort you later. I'll merely take a look from the outside." She rose, and though the vicar offered to accompany her, she declined politely. Too many well-meaning onlookers tended to trample over the very details she sought. Walking back toward Willow Cottage, she allowed her pace to slow. The village was fully awake now. Roosters called from distant farms. Children chased one another near the green, and the postman pedaled past with a cheerful nod. Yet beneath the morning's ordinary rhythm, Miss Marple sensed a discord, faint but unmistakable. Willow Cottage stood at the curve of the lane, its stone walls catching the early sunlight. As Miss Marple approached, she noticed nothing immediately amiss. No broken windows, no tracks in the soft earth near the hedges. But when she reached the back garden, she saw the door, still ajar despite the vicar's earlier effort to pull it closed. A bit of ivy tangled near the handle had snapped, suggesting it had been forced open with some strength. She leaned closer. The door itself showed no sign of damage, but the soil directly beneath the threshold bore a faint impression, too shallow for a full footprint, but enough to show someone had stood there for a moment. A pause. A decision, perhaps. Inside, she did not enter, but she made a careful study of what she could see through the doorway. The drawing room appeared orderly, its furniture undisturbed. A vase of wilting roses sat on the mantel, untouched. The rug seemed smooth, except near the far corner, a subtle shift in the pile caught her eye, as though something weighty had rested there recently. She stepped back and surveyed the garden again. The hedge bordering the neighboring property had a narrow break. Nothing dramatic, but enough space for someone slender to slip through. Curious. She followed the line of the hedge to the lane and paused when she noticed a cigarette stub half hidden beneath a tuft of grass. She crouched and examined it closely. Someone had smoked it recently. Someone who did not seem concerned about leaving it behind. Miss Marple straightened, her expression thoughtful. A harmless intruder would be unlikely to linger for a smoke so near the house, and a malicious intruder would hardly leave without taking anything. Unless, of course, the purpose had not been theft at all. She heard footsteps approaching and turned to see Constable Jones making his way toward her, his notebook in hand. "Morning, Miss Marple. I hear you've already begun your own sort of inquiry." "Just a little observation," she said pleasantly. "The back door seems to have been opened with care, not broken. Whoever entered wished to avoid waking Miss Harrow." Jones scratched his chin. Odd business, that. No signs of a struggle, no valuables missing. Perhaps she imagined more than she heard. Miss Marple gave him a gentle, knowing look. "An overactive imagination rarely opens a locked door, Constable." He blinked at that, then stepped inside the cottage to begin his inspection. Miss Marple remained in the garden, her eyes drifting back to the cigarette stub hidden in the grass. She did not touch it. Jones would find it soon enough. But the placement alone told her what she needed to know. Someone had stood there, someone patient, someone watching, and whatever they were seeking inside Willow Cottage they had not yet found it. Miss Marple drew her shawl tighter as a faint breeze swept through the garden. The day had only just begun, yet the quiet village of St. Mary Mead already felt shifted, as though some long-dormant whisper had been stirred awake. And she knew, with the certainty born of years of observation, that this was only the beginning of a much deeper mystery. The morning wore on with a deceptive calm, the kind that wrapped itself gently around the village, softening its edges and concealing the undercurrent of unease that had begun to stir. Miss Marple lingered near the garden gate of Willow Cottage as Constable Jones continued his inspection. She knew better than to interrupt. Young officers often overlooked subtle details when too many eyes pressed upon them. Still, she observed from a polite distance, her attention drifting across the property with the same patient precision she would use while untangling a stubborn skein of wool. From inside came the faint sounds of Jones's boots on the wooden floorboards and the occasional murmur as he dictated notes under his breath. Miss Marple used the time to study the garden more closely. The cottage grounds were generous enough to offer privacy, but small enough that an intruder could move through them quickly. The hedges on three sides were tall, unruly, and poorly trimmed. Convenient cover for someone who wished to approach unseen. The fourth side opened to the lane, where a few villagers passed now and then, casting discreet glances as they went. Word traveled quickly in St. Mary Mead, especially when fear accompanied it. Miss Marple's eyes shifted to a patch of soil near the side wall. A faint disturbance there suggested someone had knelt or perhaps crouched. No clear imprint gave away a shoe or boot, but the soil had been pressed in a curve, as though weight had been distributed carefully. She kept the observation to herself. Jones would notice eventually, she hoped, though she doubted he'd interpret it correctly. The young man had a straightforward mind, better suited to locks, stolen bicycles, and missing livestock than the nuances of intent. At last, Jones stepped out, wiping his brow, though the morning was still cool. "Not much to report, Miss Marple," he said, attempting a professionalism that faltered under her kindly gaze. "No signs of forced entry, except the back door being open. No fingerprints on the handle. None that I can see, anyway. House is tidy. Nothing seems touched." Miss Marple offered a small nod. "What of the ashtray in the drawing room? Miss Harrow does not smoke." Jones blinked. "Oh, that. Yes, there are 2 cigarette ends there. Probably hers, or from the previous tenant. Did you notice their brand?" He frowned at that. "Brand? Well, they looked ordinary enough. Some brands," Miss Marple said gently, "are not commonly found in St. Mary Mead." Jones colored slightly. "I'll check again." He hurried back inside, and Miss Marple allowed herself the faintest sigh. She admired the young man's enthusiasm, but enthusiasm rarely caught a criminal, not unless paired with a wider lens through which to view behavior. And human behavior, in all its complexity, was something Miss Marple understood far better than most. As she turned toward the lane, she spotted Mrs. Weatherby approaching with her basket of fresh eggs, her expression alight with curiosity. "Miss Marple, is it true someone broke into that cottage? Oh, I knew that place would bring trouble sooner or later." "Someone entered, perhaps," Miss Marple replied with gentle ambiguity. "But we know very little as of now." Mrs. Weatherby leaned closer. "I heard, mind you, this is only what Mrs. Pennington told Mrs. Riley, who told my cousin, that Miss Harrow heard voices, not just footsteps." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted only slightly. "Voices? Well, that's what they're saying." Mrs. Weatherby lowered her voice even further. "And people have always said, Willow Cottage holds odd echoes. My husband swears he heard singing from the place once, though that was years ago." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said kindly, "a quick imagination spreads more swiftly than truth." Mrs. Weatherby appeared unconvinced, but nodded anyway before continuing down the lane. The gossip would swell now, growing with every telling, obscuring the facts that mattered. Miss Marple was accustomed to sifting through such chatter with patience, separating speculation from genuine insight. As she walked slowly toward the village green, she noticed someone standing near the post box, a man she hadn't seen before. Tall, sharply dressed, with a clean-cut appearance that suggested he was more accustomed to cities than sleepy villages. His hair was dark and neatly combed back, and he carried himself with a confidence that didn't quite blend with the modest charm of St. Mary Mead. He pretended to read a letter, though his eyes flicked occasionally toward Willow Cottage. Miss Marple adjusted her pace. "Good morning," she said cheerfully as she neared him. He looked up, startled, before offering a polite smile. "Good morning. New to the village?" she asked, as though merely making pleasant conversation. "Passing through." he replied quickly. "Just visiting a friend." He folded the letter and tucked it into his coat. "Lovely day." "Indeed." Miss Marple offered her usual warm smile, her eyes taking in the smallest details. The scuff on his polished shoe, unusual for someone simply walking. The faint smell of a cigarette not sold in local shops. The quick glance he cast again toward the cottage before composing himself. "Well, I hope your visit is a pleasant one." He nodded and walked away, with a briskness that spoke of urgency rather than leisure. Miss Marple watched him until he disappeared around the bend, her mind already tucking the encounter into a quiet corner, to be examined later if needed. By midday, the village had begun buzzing with theories of its own. Some claimed the intruder must have been a vagrant. Others insisted it was a jealous suitor of Eleanor Harrow, though no one could name such a suitor. A few whispered that the house itself didn't like new inhabitants, a superstition passed down from a time when logic was less popular. Miss Marple returned to her cottage for lunch, though food held little distraction for her today. She brewed a fresh pot of tea and sat near the window overlooking her garden. The cigarette stub the intruder had left behind, the movement inside the drawing room, the back door carefully opened, all these pieces formed the beginning of a pattern. But it was Eleanor Harrow herself who intrigued her most. Eleanor was not a woman prone to dramatics. When she arrived in the village, she had done so quietly, taking up residence at Willow Cottage with a gentle gratitude that had charmed the locals. She kept mostly to herself, polite but private. Miss Marple had sensed a weight behind her smiles, but she had not pressed. Everyone carried something after all. Now, with the morning's disturbance, she wondered if that weight was beginning to surface. Later in the afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the vicarage again. Eleanor sat in the same armchair, looking weary yet composed. A faint tremble still clung to her hands, but she greeted Miss Marple with a small, hopeful smile. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said quietly. "I must seem terribly foolish." "Not at all, my dear. Fear is seldom foolish when it comes unexpectedly. May I ask, before last night, did you notice anything strange in the cottage?" Eleanor hesitated. Not strange, exactly. But a few things felt off. A book out of place. A window open I was certain I'd shut. Small things I blamed on forgetfulness. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And no visitors? Anyone unfamiliar who might have taken an interest in you?" Eleanor shook her head. "No one. I moved here to find some peace, Miss Marple, to begin quietly again." The phrasing was careful, almost rehearsed, and Miss Marple recognized the subtle shield of someone guarding her past. Whatever Eleanor had come to escape, it was now brushing against the edges of her new life. Before Miss Marple could inquire further, the vicar returned with news that the constable had found nothing more of significance. Eleanor looked equal parts relieved and unsettled. Relieved that nothing dangerous seemed evident, yet disturbed by the idea of a mystery without explanation. As she escorted herself out, Miss Marple paused by the vicarage gate. The afternoon sun stretched across the lane in soft gold, but the quiet no longer felt comforting. Something unseen was shifting beneath the surface, drawing closer with each hour. And though the village carried on with its chores and chatter, Miss Marple felt certain that Willow Cottage had not yet revealed the true reason someone had walked through its rooms in the dead of night. Rain drifted softly across St. Mary Mead the following morning. The kind of steady drizzle that blurred rooftops, washed the garden paths clean, and encouraged villagers to move about with umbrellas tucked low and collars turned up. Miss Marple found the weather rather helpful. Rain had a way of settling restless minds and revealing things that sunshine sometimes disguised. She stepped outside with a careful foot, her garden hat perched lightly atop her white curls, and paused to study the lane. The dampness deepened every footprint along the muddy edges, preserving impressions longer than usual. She walked slowly, her eyes scanning the ground as naturally as if she were admiring flowers. A pair of deep boot prints marked the soil near her gate. Jones's, no doubt. But farther along, near the curve leading to Willow Cottage, she spotted something that made her pause. A lighter, narrower imprint crossed the path at an angle, one that did not originate from any nearby doorway. The shape was distinctive, belonging to a man's dress shoe rather than the sturdy footwear villagers preferred in such weather. She had seen similar marks yesterday near the cottage hedge, and she wondered if they belonged to the stranger by the post box. The print suggested a hurried stride. Rain had blurred its edges, but enough remained to show a crisp, angled sole pattern uncommon in the village. Miss Marple tucked the observation away and continued her walk, her umbrella tapping lightly against her shoulder. The sky hung low above the treetops, and the air carried a faint, earthy scent that hinted at secret stirring below the surface of the ordinary morning. When she reached the green, she found Mrs. Hartley rummaging through the notice board with her usual enthusiasm. The woman turned at once, her expression brightening. "Miss Marple, you're just in time. I was hoping to catch you. There's talk, you know. Quite a bit of it." "There always is," Miss Marple replied with a soft smile. "What sort of talk this time?" Mrs. Hartley leaned forward. "That woman at Willow Cottage, Eleanor Harrow. They're saying she received a visitor last night. Someone tall, dark, and very insistent." Miss Marple lifted an eyebrow. "And who precisely is they?" "Well, Mrs. Riley said her nephew saw a man walking near the cottage at dusk. Not a local man, and he looked as though he was searching for something." Miss Marple thought again of the stranger she'd encountered. It wasn't unusual for passers-by to cut through the village, but a man with that polished composure was seldom here without purpose. She thanked Mrs. Hartley, offered a few soothing reassurances, and then made her way toward the high street. Rain pattered on the cobblestones, forming small puddles that reflected the muted glow of shop windows. At Mr. Cooper's grocery, she found the interior warm and fragrant with the scent of freshly baked loaves. Mr. Cooper, who prided himself on knowing every face in the village, greeted her with a genial nod. "Morning, Miss Marple. Dreadful weather, isn't it?" "Quite," she said, selecting a few apples from a basket. "By chance, have you had any new customers recently? Someone passing through, perhaps purchasing cigarettes?" He frowned thoughtfully. "Cigarettes? Well, not the regular sort. Someone bought a packet of a foreign brand yesterday afternoon. Can't say I recognized him." "Did he mention where he was staying?" "No, he left quickly. Looked like he didn't want conversation." Mr. Cooper wiped his hands on his apron. "Tall fellow, nicely dressed. Not a traveler like the ones from the inn." Miss Marple thanked him and paid for her apples. As she left the shop, she had no doubt the same man had taken an interest in Willow Cottage. She strolled toward the lane again, letting the raincoat shield her from the downpour, her thoughts unfolding in a slow, methodical rhythm. What reason would a stranger have to prowl near a cottage belonging to a woman who claimed she sought only peace? Eleanor Harrow may have intended exactly that, but people rarely uproot themselves without reason. And now, with hints of a past emerging through seemingly insignificant cracks, Miss Marple began to suspect that Eleanor's quiet arrival in St. Mary Mead had not been as accidental as the young woman had implied. She stopped at the cottage gate and glanced inside. Eleanor was sitting near the front window, her posture tense as she watched the rain fall. When she spotted Miss Marple, she immediately rose and opened the door. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect anyone today." Her voice sounded steadier, though a fragile undercurrent lingered beneath. "I hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple said gently. "I simply wanted to see how you are faring." Eleanor stepped aside with visible gratitude. "Please come in. I'm trying to settle myself, but every creak in this house sets me on edge." The cottage smelled faintly of lavender and polished wood. A fire crackled low in the hearth, though its warmth seemed unable to chase the chill that clung to the place. Miss Marple took a seat in an armchair beside the window as Eleanor settled opposite her. "You've had a difficult night," Miss Marple said. and perhaps an even more difficult morning. Eleanor nodded, her fingers twisting absently in her lap. Constable Jones insists nothing is amiss. But he didn't hear the footsteps. He didn't feel... She broke off, unable to articulate the sensation. Miss Marple waited patiently. When Eleanor did not continue, she asked, "Forgive me, but have you ever had cause to think someone from your past might seek you out?" Eleanor's breath caught. A shadow crossed her features so swiftly one might have missed it, but Miss Marple saw it clearly. She waited again, allowing the young woman to choose her words with care. "There was someone," Eleanor whispered at last. "Someone I hoped never to see again. But he doesn't know I'm here. He can't." "Are you certain?" Eleanor lowered her gaze. "I never told him where I was going. I left quietly. No letters, no forwarding address." "But with determination," Miss Marple said softly. "Some people find what they wish to find, even when they shouldn't." Eleanor flinched slightly. "You think he might be here?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that someone unfamiliar has taken interest in your cottage. Whether he is connected to you or not, I cannot yet say." Eleanor was silent for a long time. The fire crackled softly, punctuating the stillness. Finally, she whispered, "If it is him, I don't know what he wants. I left because I needed to breathe again, because he was controlling." Miss Marple reached out with a gentle, reassuring touch. "You are not alone here, and you mustn't allow fear to silence you." Just then, a sharp knock sounded at the door. Eleanor stiffened instantly, her hand flying to her throat. Miss Marple rose with a calmness that belied her own curiosity and opened the door. Constable Jones stood there, drenched from the rain. "Pardon me, Miss Harrow, Miss Marple. I've come to inform you someone was seen walking along the lane last night. Tall man, dark coat. No one recognized him." Eleanor's face paled, confirming Miss Marple's growing suspicion. Jones continued, "Also found this near your back fence." He held up a small object wrapped in cloth. When he unwrapped it, Miss Marple identified it immediately, a broken key, old and tarnished. Eleanor gasped softly. "I've never seen that before." Miss Marple examined the jagged metal, thoughtful. It appeared snapped rather than bent. A key someone may have tried using, unsuccessfully before abandoning it. Jones looked uncertain. "Could be nothing. Could be from years ago." Miss Marple shook her head. "Or it could be the very thing someone hoped to use last night." Eleanor pressed a trembling hand to her lips, and the room seemed to grow colder. Rain tapped steadily against the windows as Miss Marple's suspicions deepened. The stranger in the village had not come by accident, and whatever business he had at Willow Cottage, it was far from finished. The rain eased into a mist by late afternoon, thinning into delicate veils that clung to rooftops and drifted across the hedgerows like pale breath. Miss Marple left Willow Cottage with a mind busy with possibilities, each turning gently in her thoughts like threads waiting to be woven. The broken key lay heavily in her memory, its jagged edge suggesting effort and frustration, a failed attempt that said more than any stolen object could. Someone had tried to enter the cottage quietly, deliberately, and without violence. That alone told her much. She walked slowly toward her own cottage, letting the rhythmic patter of water on her umbrella calm her concentration. A few villagers passed her, each offering polite greetings tinged with curiosity, but she returned them with her usual warm nods. No sense inviting speculation when the facts had yet to speak clearly. She had always believed that most mysteries solved themselves when one allowed them enough patience, and when one paid attention to the smallest inconsistencies. At her gate, she paused. Something blinked faintly on the ground, a glimmer of metal against the wet soil. Bending carefully, she retrieved it, a small button, dark brass with a subtle engraved ring around its center. Not unusual, but not local either. Most villagers wore simple work attire, their clothes practical, their buttons plain. This button belonged to a coat crafted for someone who valued quiet quality. Her thoughts flicked briefly to the stranger she had passed the day before. His coat had been well tailored, and though she hadn't stared long enough to memorize every detail, she recalled a faint gleam near the cuff. She brushed the button clean and slipped it into her pocket. Another thread, another quiet detail. And she knew from long experience that when enough details gathered, a shape, often an unsettling one, began to emerge. Inside, she removed her damp coat and made a fresh pot of tea. The simple act soothed her, giving her mind room to move in its preferred steady rhythm. She sat by the window overlooking her rose bushes, now heavy with lingering droplets, and turned the button in her fingers. It was heavier than expected, not the flimsy sort easily lost. She doubted it had fallen here by accident. Someone had stood near her gate recently, whether watching her or merely passing, she could not yet say. The quiet was interrupted by a knock at the door, firm but not frantic. When she opened it, she found Dr. Leonard Graves, the village physician, his expression both troubled and thoughtful beneath his rain-spattered hat. "Miss Marple," he greeted, "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I thought I should stop by, considering all that's being said about poor Miss Harrow." "Come in, Dr. Graves," she said pleasantly. "A warm cup of tea might do you good." He stepped inside, removing his hat and shaking off droplets. "Thank you. I've been making rounds all afternoon, and everywhere I go, the only thing on people's minds is Willow Cottage." She poured tea for them both. Fear often grows louder than fact. "Indeed," he sighed. "But I confess, the girl is genuinely distressed. When I examined her earlier at the vicarage, her pulse was rapid, her nerves strained. She's not imagining her fear, that much is certain." Miss Marple nodded. "Fear rooted in something real, perhaps." He hesitated, then added, "She said something curious to me. When I asked about her health, she insisted she's been well since coming here. But when I asked whether she'd had any recent stress, she nearly froze, almost as if she feared speaking would summon something. People escaping difficult circumstances often carry their fears with them," Miss Marple murmured. "Even to the quietest villages." Dr. Graves frowned into his tea. "I hope whatever, or whoever, is troubling her leaves her in peace. She's been through enough, I think." Miss Marple listened to the sincerity in his voice. Leonard Graves was a good man, though not always perceptive in matters beyond medicine. Still, she valued his observations, however incomplete. When he left some minutes later, offering a polite bow and a promise to look in on Eleanor again, Miss Marple felt her curiosity deepen. The rain had nearly stopped by early evening. A soft grey haze settled over the fields beyond the village, and lamps flickered to life one by one along the lane. Miss Marple wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside again. Evening walks were a habit she rarely missed, and today her steps carried her instinctively back toward Willow Cottage. Not in haste, but with purpose. As she neared the lane's curve, she slowed. The cottage stood quiet beneath the fading light, smoke curling gently from the chimney. But it was not the cottage that drew her attention. It was the man standing beside the low stone wall, half hidden by the deepening dusk. The same man from before. The stranger. He didn't notice her approach. His eyes were fixed on the cottage with an intensity that suggested more than passing interest. His posture was taut, as though he wrestled internally with a decision. Miss Marple coughed lightly, a polite signal of her presence. He turned sharply. Surprise flickered in his features, followed quickly by irritation, though he masked it behind a thin smile. "Good evening." "A rather damp one," she replied, unperturbed. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced." The man hesitated, then said, "My name is Henry Talbot. A visitor to the village, I understand." "Yes, just passing through." Miss Marple tilted her head. studying him with kindly scrutiny. Passing through a second evening in a row, near the same cottage, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm visiting a friend," he repeated, "if you must know." Of course," she said pleasantly. "Though I wonder, does your friend know you're waiting for him in the rain? Perhaps he's expecting you elsewhere." His gaze darted again to Willow Cottage before he steadied himself. "I don't see how that concerns you." "Most things concern me only a little," Miss Marple said, "until they concern my neighbours. Miss Harrow, for instance, is a kind young woman who has already endured a most unsettling night." His eyes sharpened. "So she told you?" "She told the constable." He looked away, jaw clenched, frustration vibrating beneath his restraint. "She's making things more complicated than they need to be." The words slipped out too quickly, too heated, and Miss Marple caught them with quiet interest. "You know her, then?" she said softly. Talbot's breathing stilled. He opened his mouth, closed it, then forced a tight, dismissive smile. "I really must be going." Before she could say more, he strode off, disappearing into the misted lane with a quickness that betrayed his state of mind. Miss Marple watched him go, her expression unreadable. He had revealed enough, though he had meant to reveal nothing. His presence was no coincidence. His frustration suggested familiarity, and the intensity with which he watched the cottage spoke of unfinished business. She turned toward Willow Cottage once more. A lamp glowed faintly inside as Eleanor moved through the drawing room, her silhouette fragile but determined. Whatever secrets she had tried to leave behind had found their way to St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple, with her soft voice and sharper than most eyes, knew the storm was only beginning to break. The afternoon light slipped through the parted curtains of Willow Cottage as Miss Marple stood near the narrow window, watching the garden as though it might whisper the truth if she observed it long enough. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, but her attention was fixed on the space near the tool shed where Edith had once claimed to hear footsteps only hours before George Hallowell's body was found. Nothing in the garden appeared out of place now, yet Miss Marple had long understood that the most revealing clues rarely announced themselves. They waited, patient and quiet, until someone with the right eye came along. She stepped away from the window, the faint rustle of her skirt blending with the creak of the floorboards as she turned her attention back to Edith, who sat in the armchair twisting a handkerchief between trembling fingers. Edith had always maintained an image of calm authority in the village, but now she seemed diminished, weighed down by something she could not yet bring herself to say. Miss Marple settled opposite her, her knitting needles resting quietly in her lap, their silence more pointed than any question. Edith took a slow breath, the kind one takes when gathering courage, and lifted her gaze, though her eyes darted away again almost immediately. "There's something I didn't mention before," she murmured, barely louder than the ticking of the mantel clock. "I suppose I didn't think it mattered, or perhaps I hoped it didn't." Miss Marple offered a small nod, gentle enough to reassure without pressing. Very often, it is the thing we think doesn't matter that ends up mattering most. Edith swallowed, clutching her handkerchief tighter. "The night before George was found, I heard someone arguing in the garden. I didn't recognize the voice at first, but I'm almost certain it was Clara." Miss Marple remained still, though her mind tightened around the words. Clara, George's sister, had presented herself as composed and helpful since the discovery, though her grief had been strangely contained, as if she had prepared it in advance. "What made you think it was her?" Miss Marple asked quietly. It was the way she said his name, sharp, as if she were scolding him. Edith's gaze flicked toward the window. "I heard George answer her, sounding annoyed, and then something fell, or was thrown. I can't say what it was. It was a detail that pulled the threads of the investigation in a new direction, though not entirely unexpected." Miss Marple rose, moving toward the fireplace as though warming her hands, though in truth she needed a moment to consider the shape of this new information. Clara had claimed she hadn't seen her brother for 2 days before his death. Now that claim wavered like a weak plank across a river. "Did you hear anything else?" Miss Marple asked. Only footsteps moving away, and then silence. Edith's voice cracked softly. "I should have told the police. I should have said something sooner." "You're saying it now," Miss Marple replied kindly. "And that is what matters." She crossed the room, collecting her coat from the armchair and fastening the buttons with steady hands. The time had come to speak with Clara again, though Miss Marple expected no easy conversation. Clara had always been a woman who wrapped truth in layers, offering only what she deemed necessary and discarding the rest as though honesty were a luxury she couldn't afford. Before she left, Miss Marple paused at the threshold. "Edith, if there is anything else, no matter how small, you must tell me." Edith nodded, her expression earnest and fearful all at once. "I will." Miss Marple stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, the breeze carrying the scent of damp leaves and distant chimney smoke. As she walked down the path toward the village, her mind combed through the events of the past days. George had been involved in something secretive. Clara had lied about seeing him. Edith had withheld the argument she overheard. And then there was the matter of the unfamiliar footprints near the shed. Footprints neither belonging to George nor anyone known to frequent the cottage. And now, Clara's raised voice in the dark mingled with George's sharp reply, echoing through Edith's recollection. Clara's house sat modestly along the lane, its windows gleaming with the kind of cleanliness achieved only by someone desperate to control the small things when the larger things slip beyond reach. Miss Marple knocked lightly, and Clara answered almost immediately, her expression tightening with a flicker of irritation she tried too late to hide. "Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting visitors." "I shan't take much of your time," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I merely wanted to clarify a small detail." Clara stepped aside reluctantly, allowing her in. The sitting room smelled faintly of polish and lavender, everything arranged with a precision that bordered on nervousness. Clara remained standing, arms crossed, as though bracing herself for an attack. "Has something else been discovered?" she asked, her voice too calm to be natural. "Not discovered," Miss Marple said gently. "Remembered." She watched Clara's posture stiffen, the faintest crease forming at the corner of her mouth. "Edith recalled hearing you arguing with George the night before he died." Clara's eyes widened before narrowing into something brittle. "That's absurd. I haven't been near that cottage in days." Miss Marple gave her a moment, letting the denial rest awkwardly between them before continuing. "Edith heard your voice. And George's? She is not prone to imagining things." For a heartbeat, Clara's composure fractured. Then she sank onto the edge of the sofa, her hands trembling despite her effort to hide it. "We argued," she admitted at last. "But it wasn't what you think." Miss Marple moved to sit across from her, saying nothing, allowing the silence to coax out the truth. Clara exhaled shakily. "George found something. Something he thought would solve all his problems. He said it would change our fortunes, that we wouldn't have to worry about the house or the debts or anything else. But he wouldn't tell me what it was. He said it was too soon, that I'd only interfere. I went to confront him because he was being reckless. We shouted, 'Yes,' but I left. He was alive when I walked away." "And the item he found?" Miss Marple asked. Clara shook her head, frustration and fear mingling in her expression. "I don't know. He mentioned papers, old ones, but he wouldn't tell me more." Miss Marple absorbed that carefully. George had been digging in the garden. He had been secretive. And now Clara confirmed he had found something he believed valuable enough to transform his life. But no papers had been found on his body or anywhere in the cottage. "Clara," Miss Marple said softly, "if George discovered something of worth, and if someone believed he intended to use it alone, that might have given them motive." Clara swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you think someone killed him for it?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that whatever George uncovered did not stay hidden for long, and whoever sought it may not yet have found what they were looking for." Clara paled, her gaze drifting toward the window as though expecting someone to be watching. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "Be cautious, and if you remember anything else, however trivial it may seem, you must tell me." As she stepped once more into the evening air, Miss Marple felt the threads of the mystery tightening. George's discovery, Clara's lie, the missing papers. Each piece settled into place with a kind of grim symmetry, yet the picture was far from complete. The truth lay close now, stirring beneath the quiet facade of the village, waiting for the final hand to uncover it. Miss Marple walked slowly along the quiet lane, her steps steady yet thoughtful as she turned over Clara's confession again and again in her mind. The air had shifted, the earlier brightness now dimming beneath clouds that gathered as though they, too, sensed the unease threading through the village. A storm felt imminent, not of weather, but of truth. And Miss Marple understood that the next revelation would not come gently. She made her way toward the edge of the village where the Hallowell family records were stored at the small parish archive, a place few visited anymore. George's mention of old papers had lingered in her thoughts from the moment Clara spoke of them. Miss Marple had learned long ago that old papers often held new secrets, and that history, when disturbed, had a way of demanding attention. When she unlocked the archive room with the key the vicar had allowed her to borrow, the familiar scent of dust and old bindings greeted her. Shelves lined the walls, filled with the chronicles of births, marriages, land transfers, debts, wills, all the things people believed they had safely tucked away from prying eyes. They always forgot that documents, unlike people, never knew how to lie. Miss Marple scanned the files, her fingers trailing lightly across the labeled boxes. The Hallowell name appeared 3 times: an old deed, a family ledger, and an estate registry. She sat at the long wooden table, adjusting her spectacles before opening the first box. Most of the documents were perfectly ordinary, detailing little more than predictable financial struggles and minor disputes over property boundaries. Yet something seemed out of place in the estate folder, a set of pages torn unevenly, leaving only a jagged edge behind. Someone had removed documents recently. She lifted the remaining fragments, her eyes narrowing. The tear was fresh. The fibers hadn't yellowed or curled, and the faintest smudge of dirt lingered on the paper's edge. George had indeed taken something, a piece of information valuable enough for someone to track, confront, and ultimately silence him. The question was what those missing pages contained. As she noted the gap, the echo of footsteps sounded faintly from outside the room, the soft scrape of a shoe along the stone corridor. Miss Marple did not look up immediately. She merely listened, the calm mask on her face never shifting. When the sound faded again, she placed the fragment back carefully and locked the archive door behind her. The village green was unusually quiet when she stepped outside. A lone figure stood near the old well, Inspector Graves, his gaze fixed on her as though he had expected her to emerge. His expression held curiosity tinged with concern, the kind that comes when a man realizes he is several steps behind. "Miss Marple," he said, walking toward her with brisk determination, "I believe we should talk." She offered him a polite smile. "I was beginning to think the same, Inspector." Graves paused, glancing around before lowering his voice. "Someone broke into the Hallowell property last night. The back window was forced, but nothing appears taken." "Nothing visible, perhaps," Miss Marple murmured. Graves looked at her sharply. "Do you know something you haven't shared?" "I know," she replied lightly, "that George found something written, something old, and that it is now missing." He stiffened. "Old papers? Where did you learn this?" "His sister," she said, though she cannot say what they contained. Graves exhaled, his frustration clear. This case grows more complex by the hour. If George discovered something that put him at risk, we need to know what it was before someone else does." Miss Marple observed him thoughtfully. The inspector was capable, but he lacked the instinct to follow quiet motives, the kinds that burrowed deep inside families and surfaced only under pressure. "Inspector," she said gently, "if someone is searching both George's cottage and the archives, they will not stop until they find what they believe is theirs. Or what they fear might reveal them," Graves countered. A flicker of surprise warmed Miss Marple's gaze. The man was learning. They parted at the crossroads, Graves heading for the station, Miss Marple for the footpath leading to Willow Cottage. As she approached, she noticed the garden gate swinging slightly, though she was certain she had closed it earlier. The air felt heavy, the quiet too pronounced. She stepped closer, her sharp eyes scanning the ground. The disturbed soil caught her attention first, a narrow patch near the roses where someone had recently knelt or pressed a heel into the earth. Then she saw the faint imprint along the side of the shed, as though a hand, hurried or desperate, had braced against the wood. She moved toward the shed door and found it slightly ajar. Inside, the tools hung in their usual places, but the floor bore new marks. Dust shifted, a rake moved, and a small box once tucked on the top shelf now left open. Miss Marple crouched, examining the interior. Nothing of obvious value had been taken, yet the intruder had searched thoroughly. Someone else knew George had hidden something. After she stepped out, she heard a soft gasp. Edith stood near the cottage door, pale and frightened. Her hands trembled as she clutched her shawl around her shoulders. "Miss Marple, someone was here," she said. "I heard movement, but didn't dare come out." "You were wise not to," Miss Marple replied, approaching her with steady confidence. "Tell me, did you notice anyone in the lane?" Edith shook her head. "No, but I found this by the hedge." She extended her hand, revealing a small metal button. It was simple, utilitarian, but Miss Marple recognized the pattern at once. The kind issued for a specific uniform, a village maintenance worker's jacket. Yet the men assigned such clothing were few, and one in particular had been behaving strangely ever since George's death. Samuel Crowther, a quiet man who preferred solitude and had a knack for disappearing whenever questions arose. Miss Marple felt the threads of the mystery tighten again. "Edith," she said with calm assurance, "lock your doors tonight and keep the curtains drawn." Fear widened Edith's eyes. "You believe whoever came here might return?" "I believe," Miss Marple answered softly, "that they are looking for something they still haven't found." The wind swept through the garden then, unsettling the fallen leaves, and Miss Marple let her hand rest briefly on Edith's arm before turning her gaze toward the road. Somewhere not far away, someone was growing desperate, and desperation, she knew, often led to the most dangerous decisions. The evening settled into a muted hush as Miss Marple walked away from Willow Cottage, the air cool against her cheeks and the faint scent of damp soil rising from the ground. Yet beneath the village's stillness, she sensed movement, an unseen current stirring restlessly as though someone, somewhere, had begun to panic. She kept her pace steady, her expression composed, but her mind sifted rapidly through the clues that had begun to form a fragile but unmistakable pattern. Samuel Crowther. A quiet man, a solitary one, seldom speaking unless spoken to. Most villagers barely noticed him except when he trimmed hedges or repaired the wooden benches near the green. But quiet men, Miss Marple knew, often noticed more than they ought, and sometimes they took things not out of malice, but out of misguided hope or desperation. Still, she had never taken him for a man bold enough to break into houses. Unless, of course, he feared what George had found might concern him directly. As she approached the village center, she saw Samuel's hunched figure near the maintenance shed. His back turned, his shoulders lifted in a posture that suggested he had much to hide and very little courage to do so. The small lantern hanging from a hook illuminated the faint sheen of sweat on his neck despite the cold. Miss Marple paused a moment, observing him quietly before speaking. "Good evening, Mr. Crowther." He flinched visibly, turning sharply with widened eyes. His fingers tightened around the wooden broom handle he held, as though it had suddenly become a lifeline. "Miss Marple, didn't see you there." "No," she said mildly. "You didn't." She allowed a moment of silence to settle between them, the kind that subtly asked a question without putting a single word in the air. "You seem troubled tonight." Samuel shifted, his gaze flicking toward the ground. "Just a long day, ma'am." Miss Marple took a step closer. "I wonder if your day might have taken you near Willow Cottage." His breath hitched, barely, but enough. She watched his jaw tense, the muscles bunching beneath the skin. For a long moment he said nothing. "I was doing rounds," he muttered finally. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in front of her. "Doing rounds does not typically involve climbing through hedges or leaving buttons behind." Samuel's face blanched, and his fingers loosened around the broom until the tip scraped softly against the floor. "You found that?" "Yes," she answered kindly. "Edith is frightened, you know. She heard someone wandering near the cottage." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple rising and falling like something trapped. "I didn't mean to scare anyone. I just needed to check something." Miss Marple watched him carefully. Guilt clung to him, that much was clear, but it wasn't the sharp, defensive guilt of a man concealing violence. It was the hesitant, clumsy guilt of someone who knew he had meddled in something he barely understood. "What were you looking for?" she asked gently. Samuel hesitated. Then the words tumbled out of him all at once. "I thought George took something of mine. Something important." Miss Marple felt a small thread tug inside the larger tapestry. "And what might that be?" "A map," Samuel said, wiping his palms against his trousers. "An old one. Found it when I was clearing out the old storehouse by the mill. It showed some kind of boundary line, different from the one we use now. I didn't understand it at first, but George saw it and he said it could change everything." "A boundary line," Miss Marple repeated slowly, her thoughts sharpening. "Of property?" "Yes," Samuel whispered. "I didn't want trouble. I didn't think it meant anything, but when George took it without asking, I got worried. And after he died, I thought maybe someone else took it too." Miss Marple let the weight of his confession settle between them. "A boundary dispute. Land, ownership, inheritance. So often the root of tension in small villages where every acre had a history, and every history a claim. If George had discovered proof that land long believed to belong to one family actually belonged to another, motives began to multiply rapidly." "Who currently owns the land in question?" Miss Marple asked. Samuel hesitated. "The Faringdales, ma'am." The name struck the air with a quiet thud. The Faringdales, wealthy, powerful, influential even beyond the village limits. People who, Miss Marple knew, did not like surprises, especially legal ones. "Does Clara know of this map?" she asked. "I don't think so," Samuel said. "Only George. And whoever else might have been listening when he bragged about what he found." Miss Marple tucked that piece carefully away. George had never been particularly cautious. Pride had always been his downfall. If he'd carelessly mentioned the map to the wrong person, believing it would shift fortune in his favor, then it was little wonder he had met an untimely end. "Samuel," she said softly, "you must be honest now. Did you confront George yourself? Did you argue with him?" Samuel shook his head vigorously. "No, ma'am, I didn't dare. George always made me feel small, but I didn't hurt him, I swear." She believed him. Fear and guilt swirled through him, but not the kind that pointed toward murder. He had trespassed in search of a map, nothing more. "You must stay out of this now," Miss Marple advised gently. "You have done enough wandering. Leave the rest to the police." Samuel nodded, relief flooding his features, tinged with lingering shame. "Yes, ma'am, I'm sorry." Miss Marple left him in the quiet glow of the lantern and made her way toward the mill road, her steps deliberate. The map explained far more than she had expected. It connected George's enthusiasm, Clara's worry, and the break-in at Willow Cottage with unnerving clarity. But more importantly, it introduced a new player into the puzzle, one with far more to lose than any of the others. As she walked, she noticed a carriage parked near the mill, its wheels half hidden in mud. A tall figure stood beside it, striking a match to a cigarette. The spark illuminated his face just long enough for her to recognize him. William Farringdale, a man who rarely came into the village except when business demanded it. Not a man to linger idly near abandoned mills in the fading light. Miss Marple slowed her steps, her heartbeat calm despite the revelation blooming quietly inside her. William watched her approach, his expression smooth yet taut, as though he were calculating precisely how to conduct himself. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with a stiff nod. "Out for a walk?" "A thoughtful one," she replied pleasantly. He inhaled his cigarette, exhaling a thin stream of smoke. Strange time to stroll about alone. "Oh, I find the village quite safe," she said, "even when others grow brave enough to dig up old boundaries." William's gaze sharpened and the cigarette paused midway to his lips. For a moment, the night held its breath. The shadows deepened, and Miss Marple saw, reflected in his eyes, the first glimmer of fear. William Farringdale's cigarette burned low between his fingers, the ember glowing briefly before the breeze stole the heat from it. Miss Marple stood quietly before him, neither intimidated nor hurried, sensing the careful tension building like the faint rumble before a storm. William had the stance of a man who preferred to conduct his affairs from behind closed doors, yet here he was, standing in the open beside the mill, a place connected by rumor and memory, but seldom by innocent purpose. He flicked the cigarette aside, grinding it beneath his polished heel. "You're fond of riddles, Miss Marple," he said, attempting a mild, dismissive tone. "But I assure you, I've no idea what you're implying." "And yet," Miss Marple replied softly, "you seem unusually alert for a gentleman who claims ignorance." A faint muscle jumped along his jaw. His eyes darted briefly to the mill door before returning to her, a subtle glance she pretended not to notice. The mill was locked now, unused for years except as storage for broken tools and forgotten equipment. But she suspected it held something far more current. William straightened his coat. "It's quite cold, you know. Strange weather for a stroll." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said. "A chill helps one think." He gave her a thin smile that held no warmth, then stepped toward his carriage. "Well, do enjoy your thinking. As for me, I've business to attend to." Miss Marple watched him climb into the carriage, the horse shifting uneasily as though unsettled by its owner's mood. She did not stop him nor call after him, though she silently committed the moment to memory. When he drove off, wheels crunching through the gravel, she waited until the sound faded, completely before turning her attention back to the mill. The shadows around the building pooled thickly in corners where the lamplight dared not reach. She approached the door, noting the faint scuff marks near the bottom, the sort left by hurried feet. She pressed her hand against the cold wood, testing gently. It held firm, locked as expected, but not impenetrable. Whoever had been inside recently had entered not through the front, but through the side, where a narrow window sat crooked in its frame, long broken and never repaired properly. Miss Marple was far too sensible to attempt climbing through it herself. She merely examined the churned soil beneath the sill, the faint impression of a man's boot and a thin thread of blue fabric caught on the broken edge of the wood. She plucked the thread carefully, rolling it between her fingers. The color was unmistakable, the same deep navy used in the Farringdale estate uniforms. She tucked it into a handkerchief before making her way back along the path. The village lay quiet, but her mind moved swiftly. If George had discovered a map proving that the Farringdales did not own the land they so proudly claimed, then William had every reason to retrieve it. But had that desire led to murder? Or was he simply trying to cover a potential scandal before it breathed in the open? When she reached Willow Cottage, a faint light glimmered through one of the windows. Edith must still be awake. Miss Marple approached slowly, not wanting to alarm her, and knocked lightly. Edith opened the door almost at once, her eyes darting anxiously past Miss Marple, as though expecting someone far more menacing. "Oh, Miss Marple," she whispered, letting her inside. "I didn't think you'd return tonight." "I thought it wise to check on you," Miss Marple replied, lowering her voice. "Did anything else happen after I left?" Edith shook her head, though her hands trembled. "No, but I keep feeling as if someone is watching the house. I hear the oddest sounds. A twig snapping, footsteps that stop before I can see anything. Perhaps it is only my imagination." "Your imagination," Miss Marple said gently, "has proven rather perceptive lately." She guided Edith to sit while she herself stood near the mantel, gazing thoughtfully at the framed photo of Edith and her late husband. The room carried the scent of lavender and burning wood, a comforting mixture that felt at odds with the dark undercurrents hiding just beyond the threshold. "Edith," she said softly, "you must tell me honestly. Did George ever come to you in the days before he died? Did he show you anything?" Edith hesitated, a flicker of conflict moving across her features. She clasped her hands together tightly. "He came once," she admitted, her voice fragile. "He said he needed a place to hide something. I told him he shouldn't involve me in whatever trouble he was stirring, but he insisted. He hid it in the garden. Shed." Miss Marple felt her heart beat slow in a manner she recognized, an instinct sharpening into certainty. "Can you describe it?" "A folder," Edith whispered. "Old, dusty. The papers inside looked yellowed, fragile. He said they were important, that people would come looking. I begged him to take them away, but he said they were safer here than anywhere else." "And did he return for them?" Miss Marple asked. "No," Edith said, her eyes filling. "And after he died, I didn't know what to do. I didn't even check if they were still there." Miss Marple moved toward her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "They are no longer in the shed. Someone else has found them." Edith's breath caught, her lips parting in fear. "Do you think they killed him for those papers?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that whatever George uncovered had the power to set long-buried truths in motion, and those who feared the truth have now grown desperate." A sudden crack sounded outside, a branch snapping sharply beneath weight. Edith gasped. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her posture shifting subtly as she moved toward the window. She lifted the curtain just enough to peer through. A silhouette lingered near the hedge. Tall, broad-shouldered, unmoving, watching. Miss Marple lowered the curtain with calm precision, though her pulse beat steadily beneath her skin. "It seems," she murmured to Edith, "that someone is very eager to know whether the past is about to catch up with them." Edith shivered violently, clutching her shawl tighter. Miss Marple did not look away from the window. Someone out there believed the secret George had discovered was still within reach, and they were willing to follow it into the night, into gardens, into cottages, into danger. She had seen that kind of desperation before, and she knew it was only growing stronger. The silence in the room thickened as the detective stepped closer to the desk, his fingers brushing the edges of scattered documents that felt like they were holding their breath along with everyone else. A faint breeze slipped through the half-open window, carrying with it the scent of damp soil and autumn leaves, reminding him of the garden where the first clue had been found. He steadied himself, allowing the quiet to settle before he spoke, letting the truth reveal itself not through sudden declarations, but through the weight of accumulated details that had been waiting to be heard. He noticed the uneven pattern on the rug again, the the same one he had dismissed earlier as nothing more than wear and tear caused by years of pacing. But now, viewed through the lens of everything he had uncovered, it felt intentional. As he crouched, the faint indentation became clearer, as if heavy furniture had once stood there and had been removed with precise care. When he brushed his fingertips over the compressed fibers, he imagined the missing piece, a chest or cabinet, something large enough to hide documents, perhaps even instruments tied to the crimes. Someone had moved it recently, believing no one would notice. He rose slowly, turning his gaze toward the lone figure maintaining a rigid posture near the doorway. Their eyes remained fixed on the far wall, refusing to meet his, as though acknowledging the detective's stare would unravel everything they had built up to now. The detective walked toward them, his steps unhurried, thoughtful, each one an invitation to confess without force. He had learned long ago that guilt often revealed itself not in dramatic outbursts, but in stillness, in the fragile cracks of composure. He spoke gently, almost softly, drawing the person out rather than cornering them. He described the timeline again, how the tool shed key had been swapped, how the garden gate latch had been loosened, how the missing ledger had reappeared only after certain visitors left the house. With each detail he uttered, their shoulders stiffened further, a subtle tremor in their hand, betraying the quiet war happening beneath their calm exterior. The detective watched everything, not just words, but breath, hesitation, and the small, unconscious flinches that truth tends to provoke. The room seemed to shrink around them as he continued, weaving each clue into the next. He mentioned the footprint left in the flower bed, the one too deep to belong to any casual passerby. He described how the pattern matched a specific pair of boots rarely worn except during early morning chores. He recounted how those same boots had been suspiciously cleaned despite the recent rains, as though someone had been desperately scrubbing away evidence. When he spoke of the torn fabric caught on the garden fence, color drained from the listener's face, not dramatically, but in a slow fade that revealed resignation more than fear. Still, there was one piece missing, one final push to unmask the entire truth. The detective walked to the writing desk again, sliding open the narrow drawer whose stiffness had troubled him earlier. Inside, tucked beneath a stack of dull stationery, lay a single folded page. Its edges were smudged, its creases deep, as though it had been handled repeatedly during indecision. He lifted it carefully, unfolded it, and scanned the words. The handwriting was rushed, uneven, the kind produced under pressure, betraying the writer's frantic state. He read the content aloud, not for shock value, but to allow the truth to breathe in the room. The letter revealed motives layered with fear and misplaced loyalty, detailing months of anxiety and a single night of irreversible decisions. As he finished reading, the silence that followed was not empty. It pulsed with consequence. Finally, the figure by the doorway exhaled, a long, trembling breath that sounded like surrender. They stepped forward, their steps slow, burdened by memories they had tried to suppress. Their voice shook as they began to explain themselves, each sentence spilling out with greater clarity as if the act of speaking had loosened a knot that had been choking them for too long. They admitted to moving the chest, to hiding the documents that could expose someone they cared for deeply. They had never intended harm, they insisted, only misdirection, a temporary shield. But panic had taken over on the night. Everything spiraled out of control, leading to choices they never imagined themselves capable of making. The detective listened without interrupting. He had no desire to shame them. He merely needed the truth laid bare. As the confession unfolded, it became clear that the crime had not been born of greed or malice, but of desperation, a misguided attempt to prevent an even greater disaster. And yet the consequences remained the same. A life had been shattered, and another was now unraveling right before him. He walked to the window, pushing it open wider to let the cool air sweep into the room. The breeze carried away some of the heaviness, but not all. He stared at the garden below. the place where it had all started. The neat lines of freshly turned soil looked peaceful now, giving no hint of the turmoil that had once brewed beneath its surface. He thought about how the truth often hid in such places, quiet and patient, waiting for the moment someone cared enough to unearth it. Behind him, the confessing voice wavered, fading into silence. The detective turned back, noticing how small they suddenly seemed, as though the weight of their own actions had diminished their very presence. He stepped closer, meeting their eyes at last, and in that moment he saw not a villain, but a person who had slipped too far into a web of fear and obligation. Their guilt was undeniable, yet so was their remorse. He placed the letter gently on the desk and allowed a soft, almost sympathetic sigh to escape. Though the truth was now out in the open, the path forward was not simple. But clarity, at least, had returned to the room. And with clarity came the first fragile step toward whatever resolution awaited beyond this moment. The detective stood in the dim glow of the drawing room, letting the confession settle into the air like dust illuminated by a fading afternoon sun. The house, once stiff with tension, now felt hollow, as though the truth had carved out its own quiet cavern within its walls. He observed the room with the patience of a man who had spent a lifetime navigating the fragile terrain of human frailty. Everything, from the half-drawn curtains to the creaking floorboards, seemed to wait for his next move. The confessed culprit sat in the armchair closest to the fireplace, where the embers had burned down to a soft orange glow. Their hands, loosely clasped together, trembled not with defiance, but with the exhaustion of someone who had fought too long against the inevitable. They spoke again, their voice scarcely louder than the crackle of dying flames. They explained how the plan had never been meant to unravel so drastically. They had hoped only to delay, to misdirect, to protect someone whose downfall seemed imminent. But once the first lie slipped free, the rest followed like an unstoppable tide, dragging them deeper until they could no longer see where the deception ended and the truth began. The detective listened, arms folded loosely, eyes heavy with thought rather than judgment. He had encountered criminals of all kinds, cold, calculated minds who hid behind clever schemes, and others who acted without thinking at all. But this case had always felt different, from the very first clue in the garden to the quiet tremor he now sensed beneath the culprit's calm facade. This was a tragedy of entanglement, of love tangled with fear, of loyalty twisted into something dangerous. And as he looked at them now, eyes shadowed, shoulders slumped, he recognized not a hardened offender, but a person pushed too far by circumstances they could no longer control. When they finished speaking, the detective approached the mantel where the final document rested, a ledger page that had surfaced after weeks of misdirection. He traced a finger along its edges, noting the ink smudges and hurried writing that had given away so much. It contained the missing key to the entire puzzle, a record of transactions deliberately tucked away to protect someone whose secrets had threatened to ruin their reputation. Those secrets had woven the snare that ultimately forced the confession. He turned back to the culprit, whose breath caught as though bracing for condemnation. Instead, the detective lowered himself into the chair opposite them and spoke with a gentleness that surprised even him. He explained how the evidence now formed a complete picture, how every step they had taken, every attempt to shield the person they cared for, had been undone not by malice, but by their own conscience, which had refused to let them rest. The truth, he said, had a way of finding light even when buried under layers of fear. Their eyes glistened, though no tears fell. They asked whether things might have ended differently had they confessed earlier, before the situation spiraled into chaos. The detective paused, considering the question with the gravity it deserved. Perhaps some consequences could have been softened, he admitted, but the heart rarely chooses the cleanest path when guided by desperation. What mattered now was that the truth had emerged, while there was still time to set things right. As footsteps approached from the hallway, the detective straightened but maintained his calm. The officers entered quietly, their expressions solemn as they awaited instruction. The culprit stood without being asked, shoulders squared in a final act of acceptance. There was no struggle, no protest, only the quiet understanding that this too was part of the path they had created for themselves. As they were escorted out, the detective watched with a mixture of relief and sorrow, knowing that justice did not always arrive triumphant. Sometimes it arrived carrying the weight of broken intentions. When the house grew quiet again, he moved through its rooms alone, letting his gaze drift over the small details that had once seemed insignificant. The muddy imprint on the floorboards, the displaced vase on the windowsill, the slight misalignment of the picture frame in the hallway. Each clue felt like a note in a long-forgotten melody that had finally reached its final chord. The house no longer felt tense. Instead, it felt strangely fragile, as if holding the aftermath of a storm that had passed through and left everything subtly altered. He stepped outside into the cool evening air. The garden stretched before him, peaceful in the fading light, the soil still carrying faint traces of the struggle that first drew his attention weeks ago. The wind rustled through the tall grass, carrying with it the scent of earth and the distant hum of life beyond the estate. He walked among the flower beds, letting the crisp air clear the remnants of tension from his mind. The garden had been the beginning of the mystery, quiet, patient, withholding secrets beneath its calm surface. Now it felt like the final witness to a story that had reached its inevitable end. Kneeling beside the plot where the first clue had been found, he ran his hand lightly across the soil. He imagined the night when panic drove someone to bury more than evidence, bury fear, guilt, and the hope that nature's silence might protect them. But nature rarely lies. It reveals. It shifts. It loosens the ground to uncover what was never meant to stay hidden. And in that simple truth, the detective found a strange, grounding comfort. As he rose, he looked back at the house, its windows now lit by warm lamps rather than the harsh glare of investigation. The family inside, though shaken, would heal. The person they had tried so desperately to protect would face their own truths, but at least now the damage had stopped spreading. The detective knew that closure never came cleanly. It came in pieces, fragile and incomplete, yet necessary. He walked toward the gate, his coat brushing softly against the grass. The sky overhead shifted into shades of blue and violet, a quiet reminder that endings, no matter how heavy, always made room for the next morning. He paused at the gate, casting one last glance at the house and garden, not out of attachment but acknowledgement. This case, with its tangled motives and quiet confessions, had tested not just his logic but his understanding of human vulnerability. Then, with steady steps, he walked into the deepening twilight, allowing the night to close behind him, and the truth he uncovered to settle where it belonged. Not as a burden, but as a necessary illumination in a world that often hid far too much in shadow.